Hello, everyone. Maybe you're here because your teacher just assigned you a literary analysis essay and you're like, what the heck is that? How am I going to do this? What am I going to do about this? Or maybe you're here because you want to be a bit more purposeful about how you approach literary analysis. Or if you're here for another reason, feel free to let me know in the comments. And whatever reason you're here for, don't worry, because we're going to help you out here today on this writing edition of Simply Lit, where I'll teach you how to do a literary analysis in 8 steps. So if you have any questions about literary analysis, please post them in the comments. Others might have the same question, and I'm happy to help answer them. Please like and subscribe this video if you can. I really appreciate it. I also have linked this PowerPoint that's in this video in the description for reference if you want to follow along or take notes or review it later. Let's go. So before we actually get into the steps, we need a little bit of context about what we're working with here. So what is literary analysis? And for another point, what is analysis? So if we look at this definition of analysis here, so analysis is a practice of looking closely at small parts of a construct to see how they affect its meaning individually and as part of a whole. So whether we're looking at the small parts of a novel or a film or any other kind of piece of media or a piece of machinery, if we're looking at the small parts of that machinery, of that novel, of that film, of that piece of media, we're looking closely at those small parts, seeing what meaning they have on their own and seeing what meaning they have together as a whole. So that is the principle of analysis. So what is literary analysis? So literary analysis focuses on how literary rhetorical tools like plot and structure and character and setting and tone are used by the author to create meaning. So in this case, the small parts that we're looking at to make a whole are those rhetorical tools: plot, structure, character. Those are the small parts we're looking at to see how they affect the meaning of the overall work, the overall script, the overall novel, the overall short story, etc., overall poem. There we go. So that is what literary analysis and analysis are. Looking at those small parts, seeing how they affect the whole. Literary analysis specifically looking at the rhetorical tools that literature uses and how those rhetorical tools affect the whole. Now, when your teacher asks you to write a literary analysis, what are they actually asking you to try to do? So what a literary analysis is asking you to address is it's asking you to ask questions and make assertions. So it might ask you to ask questions as, why might have an author made the choices they did to create a certain rhetorical effect? Why did they leave you with a certain meaning or a theme or a character study, etc.? And so what your job is to do when you're doing a literary analysis is to find and elaborate upon textual evidence so you can ask questions about a work, and so you can then make assertions about a work. And you might be asking yourself, well, why do I need to know how to do literary analysis? What are some of the benefits that it can actually give me? So some of the benefits that it can actually give you is you're going to have to do it a lot. So just practically speaking, you'll be assigned literary analysis essays in college and high school and maybe before. It can also give you the tools to express yourself creatively, right? So you might have noticed some of your favorite YouTube channels use literary analysis all the time to analyze film and media and books and so on and so forth. So it'll give you the tool to make video essays on YouTube or podcasts on other platforms. And additionally, it can just increase your overall enjoyment of the media you consume by having a deeper understanding of the media, by understanding the small parts, those literary rhetorical tools that are making it work, that are giving it that kick. And that way you can sound really smart to your friends when you're talking about your favorite shows or books or movies and so on. And so here's the reason you're here. What are these instructions going to help you do? And so these 8 instructions are going to help you achieve the following objectives. They're going to help you approach the literary analysis strategically and purposefully. It's going to help you learn how to focus your literary analysis of a given work. It's going to help you learn the rhetorical skills you need to write a literary analysis essay or a video essay script. And it's going to help you stay motivated and avoid getting overwhelmed on a literary analysis project. And so what you are going to be able to do by the end of these 8 instructions, you are going to be able to confidently approach literary analysis within a range of genres, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, etc., and within different mediums such as film, writing, podcasts, etc. So you're going to have the tools to be able to break those down, analyze them, look at those small parts, see how they contribute to the whole. And by the end of this, it's going to give you the tools to start writing a literary analysis essay or video script. And by the end of this, you're going to have even more engaging dialogues about your favorite media. And so for the required materials that you need for this, you really don't need much. You just need a piece of paper or word processor to take notes and start getting your ideas down and start writing. You need the primary text, whatever that is you're working with. So if you have been assigned a short story for class or assigned to analyze a certain kind of film, those are the primary texts you're going to need to have handy. You also need research tools available, like your library, your campus library, your local library, library databases, or secondary relevant texts that you find through research or through a library research. So those are some of the tools you might need, the required materials you might need for this literary analysis. Now, here we are at step 1. Step 1 is asking you to ask questions. So right when you finish a piece of work, you might have a lot of questions about it. And sometimes the case is you're just given a series of prompts, you get to pick a prompt and you're good to go. And in this case, what you're going to want to do is you are going to want to pick the prompt that interests you the most to keep your motivation up, right? Follow your fascination, see where it takes you, because that'll help you not get bored, keep you on track, keep you engaged, get you to finishing that essay rather than starting it and leaving it alone, or having it incomplete, or starting it and not turning it in. So sometimes you don't have a prompt given to you and you're expected to form your own argument. And this is where the step 1 ask questions can really help and come in. So that way you don't get overwhelmed and you can approach it strategically a little bit more easily with a little less pressure by approaching it step by step. So the step 1 is asking you to ask certain kinds of questions. So it's asking you to ask questions like, what stayed with you? So when you're in class all week or outside of class or doing something else, and your mind turned to the work you recently read or the film you watched and so on and so forth, what stayed with you from that? Was it an image? Was it a character arc? Was it a certain piece of dialogue? Was it a phrase from the book that your mind just keeps turning to? So monitoring what stayed with you will be a good way to find your interests and see what you're interested in pursuing in terms of your analysis to, again, keep you interested, engaged, and motivated. Another question you should ask yourself is if anything confused you, right? Like you finished a book and you're like, why did this book end the way it did? I'm scratching my head here. I have no idea why it ended the way it did. Or if you're asking yourselves, why did a character act like this in a pivotal moment? I don't understand why they would do that. And when you're trying to find answers to what confused you, you'll be analyzing an author's choices, and that way you'll gain further insight into the work as a whole. So following the thread of what confused you can lead to some really meaningful conclusions. So that's another way to get started. Now, some more series of questions that you want to ask yourself are, what kind of patterns did you notice? Like, did an image keep recurring, like a certain kind of flower or a color or a phrase? And so analyzing patterns can be another great way to formulate an argument and gather evidence for that, because you're tracking the instances and you're finding the relevant evidence as you look through to find those instances. Another kind of question to ask yourself is, are there ironies or contradictions at work? So like, does a work have a very happy title, but the actual work itself is really depressing and sad? There's an intention to that, and you could follow that thread to say something particular about why this contrast exists, or do certain characters behave differently in certain contexts that's contrary to their nature. You might explore that contradiction, see what that says, what that author was trying to say in terms of the overall work and themes of the story. And again, these can be elaborated upon to formulate that essay. So The important things to remember in this first stage, this first step, is that you don't exactly need to know what you're writing on. You're just brainstorming and feeling some ideas out. You're posing your own questions, you're trying to answer them. And as you're asking questions, try to think of questions that spark discussion and debate. So here's a simple example. If someone asks you, did you see that it was snowing outside? That's a closed-ended question. You're just yes or no. Yes, I saw it. If somebody asks you, how do you feel about the snow outside? That can spark some discussion and debate. So that's what I mean by good questions can spark debate and discussion. And also consider the length of your essay. So for the questions you want to pursue, is your essay long enough to fit that potential answer? Is a 3-page essay going to be a long enough length for you to unfurl and develop your argument in the space it needs? On the other hand, is your question too narrow? Do you have a 10-page essay to write and you can only generate 3 pages of content based on the question you've chosen to pursue? And so why we're doing this, why we're asking ourselves questions, is because you are going to pick one or more of the questions that you're thinking about, and you are going to try to answer those questions so you can begin formulating an argument that's going to be the backbone of your essay, of which you'll try to support with evidence from the text. Now, here we have our step 2. We're gathering our evidence. So now that you know the question that you want to answer, questions, you want to find evidence from the text to support, to help answer that question. Now, you don't need to have decided just yet, again, on your exact thesis and how exactly you're going to write about this. You're just letting the ideas marinate, right? The ideas in the material marinate, just letting it sit, letting it percolate in your mind, letting it simmer. Now, as you're gathering evidence, make sure to annotate. And what I mean by annotating is just writing in the text. So, right, if you're reading a book, you're writing margin notes in the book, you're making your own keys in terms of what each of your notes mean, you're starring important points, for example. Or if you're working on like a Kindle edition, a digital edition, you can digitally highlight, digitally make comments and notes, and mark relevant passages. So it'll just be important, so that way you can refer to that evidence later, and you'll have notes as well that will help you start making those connections. And as you start to reread your notes, you'll start making those connections between those examples, which will help you to start formulating your thesis. And the kinds of evidence you're going to find and be pulling from the text are these small pieces, these rhetorical tools we mentioned earlier that compose the overall work. So here I've divided it into 2 categories. There's story rhetorical tools. So these are such elements as plot, character, conflict, the narrator, themes in the work, and there's stylistic rhetorical tools such as structure, point of view, diction, syntax, which is sentence structure, tone, imagery, figurative language. So right, the story rhetorical tools have to do with elements that do with the story of the work, and stylistic rhetorical tools have to do with the structure of the work, the more structural elements. And so now that we're in step 3, you are going to craft your thesis. So now that you know the question you want to answer and you've gathered some evidence for it, you're going to start crafting your thesis statement. So what the heck is a thesis statement? The thesis statement is an arguable claim that can be supported by evidence and arguments. So it's something that can be argued one way or the other, for or against, and can be supported by evidence from the text and other supporting sources and concrete arguments. So some things that a thesis statement should do is they should be something that you think is true about the text, but isn't a simple yes or no question. Like I mentioned before, that simple example of, did you see the snow versus what do you think about the snow, right? You want it to be more than a yes or no question. You want it to be complex enough to be able to develop through evidence and arguments throughout your essay. And typically your thesis is going to become coming and featured in the last lines of your introductory paragraph. So typically a thesis is about 1 to 2 sentences in length, but of course it can be different lengths. You just got to feel it out, see what works, edit it, and go from there. And what a thesis should be doing as well is arguing for a clear interpretation of the text. You're showing one way the text can be understood. And when you are showing that, highlighting that in your thesis, you're going to elaborate upon that by, again, using evidence from the text, citing those relevant rhetorical tools that we mentioned, the story rhetorical tools, the structural rhetorical tools, and other relevant resources to support your particular interpretation of the text. So your thesis is saying exactly how you think this text should be understood. So step 4 is asking you to develop and structure arguments, because your thesis is going to dictate what form the body of your essay is going to take. It's going to inform the whole rest of your essay. And certain essay prompts might ask you to do certain kinds. They might ask you to compare and contrast, or they might have you do multiple kinds of analysis, and you might find yourself needing to do multiple kinds of analysis and argument. So below, we're just going to briefly cover some arguments that can be used to structure a well-argued case for your thesis. And you might also want to keep in mind the different kinds of argumentations are going to influence and inform the nature of the analysis, right? If you're comparing and contrasting, that is inherently comparing and contrasting. If you're debating something, essentially you are putting forth an argument for or against something. So if you're using these different kinds of elements, right, you are structuring your analysis in a very deliberate and a specific kind of way using different kinds of arguments. So the first one we're covering here is a compare and contrast argument. So we're all pretty familiar with that, examining 2 or more topics, comparing their similarities and contrasting their differences. Another kind of argumentation is this idea of tracing. So you might trace an image or a phrase or a piece of dialogue throughout a text, and you're going to make connections between the different occurrences in which this particular image, for example, that you are following throughout the text. And you're following and analyzing these and making connections between the different occurrences, because it's going to give you a greater understanding of the work as a whole and a greater understanding of the traced object individually. And that will let you know and inform your analysis of how that object has the influence that object has on the overall themes and stylistic strategies of the text. Now, debating is another form of argument. So debating, you might debate on a moral or ethical or aesthetic issue raised by the text. And what I mean by aesthetic is like a craft or writing-based issue, for example. And you might be asked to judge a character or a group of characters. And so these arguments aren't just based on your personal reactions and feelings. And of course, there's some room for that as well. And it just depends on the kind of essay and analysis you're crafting. Instead, where the majority of this kind of debating argument is going to come from is going to be from evidence from the text itself and other relevant resources, like I said, those potentially secondary sources that also critique or comment upon your primary text. Now, another thing you want to consider is if you're debating something, if there's critical terms that you need your audience to know, make sure to introduce those in the introduction. And another thing to consider is that strong debate-driven argumentation strategies often argue for something surprising or that something that people hadn't considered before. So, right, people have been talking about some of these texts you're reading for like decades or even hundreds of years. So you want to bring something new to the table. How can you deepen the discourse rather than just rehashing what's been said about the work? What's something new you can say about this work that hasn't been said before? Now, step 5, we're considering our title. Titles are vital to a good literary analysis essay and any kind of essay. And so the title should clearly indicate the focus of your analysis. And here are just a few different ways you can go about structuring your title. So one way a literary analysis title often functions is it often incorporates the name of the author in the analyzed text. And I'll give an example of that in a moment. It can also be clever and creative, but it shouldn't be so clever and so creative that your audience doesn't have a good idea of what the essay is going to be about. Right, imagine you've published your literary analysis essay and a student is now looking in a database for your essay. And they're trying to filter through a bunch of different titles of essays. So your essay should be clear enough so that your potential reader knows exactly what they're getting in for and has a good idea that it might be the kind of information that they're looking for as soon as they see the title. And of course, that depends on your audience too, right? So that's a student audience looking in databases. Your instructor, your teacher might already know exactly what text you're looking at. So you can have a little bit more room to be clever and creative with your title because it might not necessarily need to have the author or the analyzed text in the name. So that's something to consider. It should also be concise and engaging. So here is one potential title structure. You use the title is a quote from the text and a colon plus the rest of your title. So I'm also incorporating some from that first bullet point here in my made up example. So the quote from the text would be "The dog sat, colon, a post-colonial analysis of William Blake's dog walks." So there we have the kind of analysis we're doing and the author and the title of the author's works. So that's one way you can structure titles. Now, step 6, here we are crafting our introduction. So the introduction is typically the first paragraph of your essay and is typically 1 paragraph in length. But again, these rules can be bent. They should just be done so purposefully and deliberately. But typically, it's your first paragraph and is 1 paragraph in length. So what your introduction should do is it should give an overview of your argument. So it's presenting your topic, it's articulating the issues and questions you'll address. And you'll also want to provide any context and brief mention of relevant discourse. So like I said, some of these works have been being talked about for decades or hundreds of years. Are there important things to consider for your essay of things that have already been said about? Perhaps you're setting the stage to debate a common assertion about this work and you need to introduce and give some brief relevant discourse about this particular work. And of course, like I said, you'll want to provide whatever context, other context your reader needs to understand this essay. One of the more critical components that your introduction needs to do is answer the question of so what? So what? Why is this topic important? And why is your position on this topic of note? So what are you bringing to this table? Why should your reader read this essay? And an introduction typically engages your reader's interest and it can potentially reveal an under-considered argument. Like I said, it might be something surprising or something that hadn't been considered or a new way of reading the text. So that's when we can get that engagement, answering this so what question. Why is this topic important and why what you are saying about this topic specifically is important. And another thing your introduction should do is it should present your thesis statement and is typically near the end of the introduction. It might be the last 2 sentences, it might be the last 2 sentences, and then there's 1 more sentence after that. So just be aware that that's where it typically goes. And another thing your introduction should do is indicate the organizational structure. So is this a compare and contrast essay? Is this a trace essay? Is this a debate-based essay? And you don't necessarily always have to explicitly spell it out because the way you frame your argument might just implicitly imply the kind of argument that it is. But if it isn't clear, make sure to make it clear. And another thing the introduction should also indicate is the scope of your essay. So again, we talked about the page length and how deeply you're going to investigate the topic. So indicate how deeply are you really going to dig into this topic. Now, a typical introduction structure might begin with a general statement about the text and the author, and that will lead into the thesis statement. So you're moving from the general to the specific. And I'll reference the 5-paragraph essay in a moment, but if you haven't heard of what the 5-paragraph essay is, it's typically a model that's drawn as an upside down pyramid, 3 rectangles thereafter, and then a right side up pyramid. And so the reason a 5-paragraph essay starts with that upside down pyramid is because that's your introduction, and your body paragraphs of the rectangles, the right side up pyramid is your conclusion. And so the introduction is the upside down pyramid because it's going from the broad to the narrow. moving from the general to the specific. And so your introduction might refer to a common interpretation of this text and how you're going to contradict it further or narrow the focus of the argument. And you can end with a brief indication of what your reader can expect in the main body of the essay. And that's typically what your thesis does. Your introduction and your thesis are essentially a roadmap to your essay. So, right, we have our introduction as this is where we're going, this is what we're going to talk about. The body paragraphs are the actual experience of the road trip that your roadmap is outlining. The conclusion is saying, wow, we've been to all these places, we went on this trip, and now we're here reflecting on it. So that's what I mean by it's kind of like a roadmap for your essay. It's telling your reader exactly all the places we're going to stop at along the way to get to our destination. So something you want to avoid in your introduction is being vague, opening with larger than life dramatic assertions. So don't be too dramatic. We often know when we're being too dramatic, so keep it pretty level. Don't overly praise the text because then that'll skew your argument. Your reader will think you're biased as well. And make sure to stay off topic. There might be other interesting things to talk about, but you are specifically talking about one or a series of ideas, and you're making sure to stay on topic in your introduction and keep the focus on those ideas. Now, step 7, here we have our body paragraphs. So you'll take those arguments you developed in step 4 and your thesis and your introduction, and you're going to use those to inform the construction of your body paragraphs. Like I said, your thesis and introduction are serving as a guide for your body paragraphs, and each body paragraph is going to focus on one specific relevant piece of evidence as to why your reader should take your thesis as correct. Now, like I said, a typical structure analysis-based essay is referred to as a 5-paragraph essay, right? That's 1 introduction paragraph, 3 body paragraphs, and 1 conclusion paragraphs. And of course, there are variations with longer intros and conclusions and that have more than 3 body paragraphs. So don't feel constricted by a 5-paragraph essay. If you need 7 body paragraphs, 2 introductory paragraphs, 2 conclusion paragraphs, go for it. Just be purposeful and strategic about it. And that's a model you can always refer to, having 1 introduction, having 1 conclusion, and having as many body paragraphs as you need in the middle. So, and excuse me, I meant 1 introduction paragraph, 1 conclusion paragraph, and as many body paragraphs as you need in the middle. Now, something your body paragraph should do is that they should only include analysis that supports your thesis argument, right? There are so many cool things we could talk about a particular given work, especially when we're interested in it. Our brain is pulling us in all these kinds of different directions, but we really want to just focus on the information that's just relevant to our thesis and proving our thesis argument. And you're also going to want to begin each body paragraph with strong topic sentences. So you can think of topic sentences like a mini thesis, right? Where a thesis tells our reader where a whole essay is going to go. A topic sentence tells your reader what this body paragraph is all about. And typically body paragraphs are, or excuse me, typically topic sentences for body paragraphs are the first sentence of a paragraph, but they aren't always. And another thing that body paragraphs do is fully and completely develop one single thought that supports your thesis. So it supports the body paragraph will outline one relevant piece of analytical evidence or argument to support your thesis, and make sure to not overstuff your paragraphs. Each individual paragraph should stand on its own as one single piece of your argument. So if you find a related argument coming up in one body paragraph, just split it, make another body paragraph. If you find it one idea spiraling into multiple, make multiple body paragraphs. So just make sure that they're not overstuffed, that they're nice and concise, that they're nice and tight, they have their focus set, and that way you'll have strong body paragraphs. Your readers will know exactly how each individual piece of evidence supports your thesis, and you'll go a long way towards convincing them that your interpretation is one way that this text should be read and looked at. Now, Body paragraphs also should use textual evidence. Like I said, most of the support for your thesis is going to come from your textual evidence. So make sure to back up your arguments with relevant evidence from the text, and incorporate evidence as well, if necessary, from relevant secondary sources. So again, like these are like peer-reviewed articles about the text, or film reviews, or credible video essays, etc. These are secondary sources, whereas your primary source is your primary text, the film or piece of media or book or essay or short story or poem that you're analyzing. And you're going to also want to use direct quotes and paraphrases from the text to cite relevant evidence. So whenever you incorporate a quote or paraphrase into your text, and a paraphrase is rephrasing a direct quote in your own words, and you are going to want to make sure to comment on that quote or paraphrase with your own analysis. You're going to want to introduce it, step 1, quote, step 2, comment on it, step 3. And that way you are using quotes effectively, and your reader will become further convinced of your stance on the text, because they're saying the context with which the quote is being presented in terms of your argument, the quote itself, which is powerful in itself, and your analysis, your comment of the quote or paraphrase. And make sure to not end a body paragraph with a quote or paraphrase. Always end on your own analytical point and or transition. So that transitions into body paragraphs should use transitions effectively. So good body paragraphs feel like parts of a whole, because they are. They are some of the components that compose the whole essay. And so make sure to use transitional words or phrases to indicate their kinds of connections to preceding and proceeding paragraphs. That's easier said than done. Sometimes it's easier to transition from one idea to the next, and sometimes it's a little more rough, but do as best you can, be purposeful about it, and you'll be able to structure transitions effectively. And of course, we have examples of our transitional phrases. However, similarly, on the contrary, therefore, furthermore, that way we know, and those specific words have a function to indicate a specific relation to preceding or proceeding ideas. Right? However, is contradiction, similarly is comparison, therefore is a result-based, furthermore is an additional point, right? So here we have our final step, step 8, the conclusion. So what are some things your conclusion should do? Your conclusion should do more than simply restate the thesis. And I'll elaborate that on a bit more in a moment. Because your thesis is your central argument, but your conclusion of your essay should do more than just summarize that. It should take the arguments you presented and synthesize them, and thus way, once again, recontextualizing your thesis in terms of the end of the essay, whereas the introduction posed your thesis as like, this is where we're going to go. Your conclusion has a tone of, this is where we've been, and now we've come to a new understanding of why this thesis is important and relevant, which brings us to revisiting the so what question. You're again emphasizing why this topic and your position on it are important. What do your readers now know that they didn't know before? And how will this knowledge help them better appreciate or understand the work overall? And some things your conclusion should not do is it should not introduce any new quotes or information or arguments. It should also make sure it stays relevant and on topic. So don't spiral out into a million different ideas. Keep it nice and tight, relevant to the argument you set up. Like I said, the introduction has a tone of this is where we're going. Conclusion has a tone of now we're here. Let's think about all the things we went through. And you also want to avoid making any grand or overly dramatic statements. Again, avoiding the dramatic, because your reader will see through that. They'll think it's a little hokey. They don't want none of that. And you might approach your conclusion in this way. You're going to summarize, synthesize your key arguments, moving from the specific to the general. That's one way to approach it. Like I said, 5-paragraph essay. Conclusion is right side up pyramid, specific to the general. Stress your conclusion and the key arguments it led you to, and highlight your new perspective your thesis has provided on the text as a whole. So again, you are reframing your argument and contextualizing it in a new and dynamic way rather than just rehashing it. And so just because you're moving from the specific to the general doesn't mean it becomes any less particular to your argument. You're just addressing that so what question on slightly different levels as you navigate throughout the conclusion. And here's a literary analysis checklist you can refer to again later. Here's some elements that for sure your approach and your final literary analysis should have is an arguable thesis, careful attention to the language of the text, attention to patterns or themes, and a clear interpretation of the text. And so if you're having any problems, you need some troubleshooting, get help. You're not alone in this. There are definitely resources. So reach out to relevant resources like your instructor, your teacher. Your teachers are there to help. I'm a teacher myself, and I really appreciate it when students come to me to ask for help. So don't feel like you're bothering them. That's their job. They're here to help you. They're happy to support you, moreover. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out. They can be one of your greatest resources. They know exactly what they're trying to teach. So go to them if you're unsure with any questions, or if you need further help with revising your drafts, go to them during their office hours. Your campus writing center is also a great resource, so make sure to utilize them. They're often free with your tuition. And your librarian is a great source. They've studied to be a librarian, so they know how to do research. They know how to dig deep into certain topics, so definitely ask them. You might do independent research to generate more ideas as you read other people's takes on a particular text, and it'll help you refine your own ideas as well. You can have peer review from your classmates in or out of class, or you can have trusted and capable friends or family help you revise a literary analysis essay. So thank y'all for listening to this literary analysis video in 8 steps. If you have any questions, please let me know what questions you still have in the comments, and I'm happy to help you answer them. And please like and subscribe to this video. It really helps me out. So I'll see you all next time on Simply Lit. Thank you.